Welcome to the Church of the Redeemer in Ruston, Louisiana, in Lincoln Parish, across the street from Louisiana Tech University in Louisiana in the United States. Today is session 4 out of 8 on the book of Revelation, and we're using this book, Conversations with Scripture, edited. The series was edited and this volume was written by Dr. Fred Schmidt, who is a very well-trained New Testament scholar and has become a spiritual director and is now a parish priest. He's my age and he's still working just like me. So therefore, that's how it is these days. Today we're looking at chapter 3 of Schmidt's book, which is called Revelation as History. You'll remember that in chapter 1 of the book, Revelation as Roadmap, that's essentially the roadmap reading of Revelation that, okay, these things in the book of Revelation mean this thing is going to happen next week, this thing is going to happen next year. In other words, the book of Revelation was a roadmap to the future, and that's fine, except it doesn't work, because that's the kind of literature that apocalypses are. With apocalyptic timetables, that's just not what that literature is about. And then the last Sunday, we looked at Revelation as myth and the mythic way of looking at the book of Revelation. And I think that's equally bad. And so what he's trying to tell you in this chapter, pages 31 to 44, is applying historical criticism to the book of Revelation, just as we do apply it to all the other books of the Bible. And then if you look on the schedule, you'll see that starting next Sunday, October 6th, and then going for a couple more Sundays, we have his next chapters, which deal with 5 or 6 chapters of the book of Revelation. And I'm looking for somebody to lead it on the 6th, the 13th, and the 20th. I don't feel that I have to do it. And we want to, we're trying to, I know how to lecture through the New Testament, but I think one of the things that we could do in a class of this size is that we could have a really good discussion of the chapter, and we wouldn't really need to record it. So I'm hoping that we can move away after today from lecturing. Not that I think that lecturing is bad, although we do have one parishioner that does think it's bad. But nonetheless, the whole point is, the book of Revelation is there, and this is a really good study guide. And so the issue is, how do we read Revelation and Schmidt's book, and what does that say to us as Christians? And this is a slide we've seen before. What's the point of the book of Revelation? Well, my belief is that the original intent of the book of Revelation was to help Christians in the late first century remember that there's a war going on between good and evil at all times. This isn't new. It goes back to the second creation story in the book of Genesis, right? Where Eve was seduced by the talking snake. And then the other thing that this book of Revelation is about is to strengthen Christians, especially originally first century Christians, to endure persecutions, because we know that God will win the war between good and evil, right? And then to inform Christians of the fact that no nation on planet Earth is without problems. The book of Revelation is written against the Roman Empire. You got that? The Roman Empire is Babylon, and sometimes referred to as the whore of Babylon. That is code for the Roman Empire, okay? And so the Roman Empire had its problems, but our country has its problems too. And so in this chapter, chapter 3, pages 31 and following, Schmidt deals with historical criticism of this book. The roadmap readings don't work. The mythic readings don't tell anybody really anything. The mythic readings allow you to say, okay, I see this, and somebody says, well, I see that. Somebody else says, well, it's about this, and somebody else says, this is about that. And so, okay, who's right? How would anybody know, see? So that's the reason that we use historical criticism, is to try to have some more objective means to look at early Christian texts or Hebrew texts to say, okay, why were they originally written? What was the original authorial intent? Why did the author write this text? And that is something that is the cornerstone of biblical studies at the current time. He mentioned the Wizard of Oz, and toward the end of the chapter, he has a section called Leaving Left Behind, or something like that. The Wizard of Oz is a movie, and we've all seen it a million times, but of course, some people used to think that it was a political analogy, and that was the consensus of scholarship, that it was originally a political analogy, and he was trying to say this is really about American politics and the quest for gold. And of course, we all do know that scarecrows don't walk and talk, Tin Man don't walk and talk, lions are not usually lacking in courage. And so these three figures do not reflect biology as we know it. The land of Oz also does not exist in geography or global politics, nor do good or wicked witches, nor do wizards. So the question is, do you read it as a political analogy, which was done for a long time, or do you read it simply as a children's story? And so something is to be said for both approaches to it. And so I thought that was one of the most interesting parts of this chapter. You can view the movie as you always have, as a children's story, or you can view it as a political allegory. And so the scholarship on the Wizard of Oz is divided on this point, just like the Bible, right? And so when you do historical criticism of the Bible, you ask basically 5 questions. And these are questions that, in my opinion, are always appropriate to ask about biblical texts. Who, as in who wrote it? What, as in what kind of literature it is? Where was it written? When was it written? Was it written in the 1st century? Was it written in the 1st century BCE? If it's the book of the prophets, was it written in the 7th or 8th century BCE? And of course, the biggie is why. Why did the writer write this biblical book? You can also say, why did the early church canonize this book and say this book is inspired Holy Scripture and make it part of a closed collection of literature called a canon? And so when you're asking those questions, who, what, when, where, and why, especially why, you are seeking to answer the questions of historical criticism. And these questions did not appear for the first time in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment happened to a large extent in the late 18th century, and it came into biblical studies in the late 18th century and especially all through the 19th century. There are a lot of people in a lot of places that will tell you just how terrible the Enlightenment was, and I don't agree with that. For example, when we study the collection of Paul's letters in the New Testament, there is a Pauline corpus which has 14 letters, and when we study the Pauline corpus, we have 14 letters from Romans through Hebrews, and the question that we always ask is, did Paul actually write those letters? And some of them he did not write. Hebrews was, even in the late 1st century and all through the early church, part of the early church never believed that Hebrews was written by Paul. And for some reason, it's in the Pauline corpus, and it's not at the beginning in the order of its length like the actual Pauline letters are. They're in order of length. Paul to churches in order of length, Paul to individuals in order of length, and then Hebrews. Hebrews is at the last, the 14th letter, as if to say it doesn't quite fit, you see. So a lot of people didn't believe that Paul wrote Hebrews. Origen didn't believe it, and he was the greatest biblical scholar in the early church. In 1845, the father of modern Pauline studies argued that only Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians were actually written by Paul. And all the others were pseudonymous except for Hebrews, which is not pseudonymous but is anonymous. And so whether or not you think Paul wrote all those letters has an absolutely direct bearing on what your understanding of Paul's theology is. If you think that Paul wrote Ephesians and Colossians, then you have to revise your thinking about Paul's theology from what you see in 1 Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians 15 and Romans. Because in Ephesians and especially Colossians, you've got a different understanding of eschatology, the theology of what happens at the end of time. So Colossians doesn't fit. Ephesians doesn't fit. I wrote a book about 2 Thessalonians not fitting. I got the honor of being called Dr. Hughes on the basis of that book. But anyway, in the Gospels, in the late 18th century and all through the 19th century, there was the thing called the Life of Jesus movement. And it asked whether or not particular sayings in the Gospels, in other words, sayings of Jesus, along with miracle stories, whether or not these really went back to an event or a saying in the lifetime of the historical Jesus, known as the Jesus of history. This was extremely controversial. And of course, Albert Schweitzer's greatest book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, was all about this controversy. And so using historical questions, asking historical questions allows you to ask, okay, when was it written? To whom was it written? Who wrote it? And was one piece of some of the Gospels a source for some of the other Gospels, since all four Gospels deal with the life of Jesus? And so in the Gospels, we do source criticism. And the big deal in the Synoptic Gospels is of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which one is first and which one was the source of the other two. And so the older the passage is, if you can show that Mark is the source of Matthew and Luke, then stuff that's in Mark is older than a lot of the stuff in Matthew and Luke. And the older it is, the more likely it is to go back to the Jesus of history. So we're very interested in the Gospels as to how old the sayings are in the Gospels and the likelihood that they go back to the historical Jesus. And so we've spent about 150 years in the New Testament, in the study of the New Testament, dealing with that. Of course, you're familiar with this diagram. You can see that Mark is the source of Matthew and Luke, and then Matthew and Luke have 230 verses not in Mark, and we call those Q. And then there's M and there's L, but M and L means the other pre-Matthean stuff and the other pre-Lucan stuff. And I certainly don't think it was a separate source. So you can see that when you can look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you can determine that Mark is a source for Matthew and Luke, then you can say the stuff that's in Mark is older than the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And that allows you to get some idea of what the older strata of the Jesus sayings are. And that's really very important. And so eventually, for example, in the Gospels, Jesus spoke Aramaic. Aramaic is not Hebrew. Jesus spoke Aramaic. And then what happened was the New Testament that we have is Greek. It was written in Greek. We don't have any Aramaic manuscripts of it. We don't have any early Hebrew manuscripts of it. We do have something called Shem Tov's Matthew, but that appears to have been a translation from the Greek. And so you've got, start at the top left, you've got the oral teaching of Jesus in Aramaic, the language he understood and he spoke. And then eventually, after his death and resurrection, churches were formed. And these churches, a few of them were Aramaic-speaking churches because the disciples of Jesus were Aramaic-speaking. And then eventually, before and after the Jerusalem Conference, and the Jerusalem Conference is described in Galatians 2 and in Acts 15, and that probably happened in about the year 50. And so basically by the year 50, there are already Gentile congregations, and these Gentile congregations around the Mediterranean and of course up in Antioch, they all speak Greek. And Acts says that it was in Antioch where the disciples were first called Christians. And so when you begin to get Greek-speaking churches, then the words and works of Jesus, which had been circulating orally in Aramaic, suddenly it makes the jump to Hellenistic Greek. And so eventually there are these long threads, these long strands of Greek narratives of Jesus' words and Jesus' deeds. If Q existed, it was to a great extent a saying source. And so Q is sayings of Jesus sort of put together like pearls on a string without a narrative frame. And then Bud Ochtemeyer many years ago showed that there was a catena or chain of miracle stories that underlay the miracles in Mark. So the narratives are beginning to form of the works of Jesus and the words of Jesus. And eventually they get edited. And they get edited and collected in different ways. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are compared with each other. Matthew and Luke look at Mark and use it as their skeleton. And the beginning of Luke, he says, there are many who have written narratives of the things that have happened among us. And now I am going to do it akribos, accurately. So the narratives that Luke 1:1 refers to would be the sources of the Gospels, or maybe Mark. And he says there are many of them, paloi. And eventually, by the late first century, you get the 3 synoptic Gospels, and then later, perhaps, you get the Gospel of John. And so, how do you know all this? You've just heard a bunch of theories, but this is a way of basically looking at the real reality is Jesus spoke Aramaic. The New Testament is written in Hellenistic Greek. So somehow you have to have some kind of explanation of how you get from a Semitic language to the Greek of the New Testament and the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, which are the words and works of Jesus. Jesus assuredly spoke Aramaic. The New Testament assuredly is written in Greek. And so what you have on this slide is a way of trying to explain how you get from the Aramaic teaching of Jesus to the 4 Gospels in Greek in the New Testament. And by the way, the New Testament has around 5,700 manuscripts of all or part of it. And so that makes it by far the best attested book from the ancient world. So the deal is, the reality is an Aramaic-speaking Jesus and the Greek Gospels. And so what we have to do is try to explain how you get from one to the other. And so that's a pretty complicated explanation. And so if you don't like that explanation, make your own explanation. But this is what makes sense to me. And so what we do in historical criticism is that we put together theories that make sense of the historical realities that we have, such as an Aramaic-speaking Jesus and the Greek Gospels. And so one of the things that people don't like is the word criticism in historical criticism. Well, a krites is a judge in antiquity. And a hypokrites means an actor because you're sitting under a judge. And so the judge is the one who tries to make a right judgment when there is some question. And so criticism is not saying, well, it's no good. Criticism means we're trying to figure out how we make the right judgment in these historical questions. And one of the things that people don't like, and undergraduates really dislike it, and seminarians frequently dislike it, some of my colleagues sometimes dislike it, is that when you deal with the past, given that we do live in the 21st century, when I talk about the first century and its literature and what was going on in early Christian communities, I can only say what I say based on probabilities rather than 100% certainty, because I wasn't there, right? I can only say this is what is most likely to have taken place. And that is all that any historian can tell you about anything that happened in the past. I'm certain that God exists, but I'm frequently uncertain about how to interpret biblical texts. And when people like me tell you that the interpretation of biblical texts is based on probabilities, this is not what you were taught when you were in Sunday school and you were 10 years old. I get that. And so the Gospels were probably written, Mark as early as 70, 80 or 90 or so for Matthew and Luke, and probably the early 2nd century for John. And so John may have existed in several forms before the form we have it now. And so we believe that Mark was a written source for Matthew and Luke, and some people believe that it was a written source for John as well. Paul's letters, the reason we can date Paul's letters is because we can date Paul, right? Paul's letters were written, if Paul really wrote them, they were written during the lifetime of Paul. By early church tradition, Paul was beheaded while Nero was emperor. And Nero was emperor, and it appears that 62 is a pretty good date within Nero's reign. And so then there are other letters that seem to reflect the death of Paul, like Colossians. In Colossians, Paul is portrayed as saying, I make up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. And he also says that he and other Christians are up there with Christ in heaven already. And that's very difficult to ascribe to the letter to Paul himself. But anyway, we know that all of the authentic letters, minus 2 Corinthians and plus Hebrews, were quoted by the Bishop of Rome, Clement of Rome, in a letter. We call this letter 1 Clement, probably in 95 to 96 CE. By the way, the Corinthian church had thrown out their priests. And so First Clement he's the Bishop of Rome, and on behalf of the church in Rome, he writes this very severe letter to the church at Corinth, telling them, what you just did, you can't do, right? And so he basically tells them that if you're on the side of disunity of the church, you're on the side of the devil, and it goes on from there. It's a wonderful letter. But what this tells you is that if Paul's letters are being quoted by 95 or 96 CE, that means they have to have existed, and they had to be in circulation. And for Clement of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, to quote them, they had to be thought to be authoritative by the Bishop of Rome by that time, to be used to correct the Corinthian church. So that tells you a lot about how the letters of Paul were, what esteem they were held in 95 or 96, assuming that that dating is correct. And then the question is, how do you apply historical criticism to John? And so there are a lot of details in Revelation. You have this person named John. We don't know who it was. And the letters that are written to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. The other churches elsewhere are not in the picture. It's the Asia Minor churches that are in the picture. Rome is identified as Babylon, and even polemically as the whore of Babylon. And we know that the writer of Revelation was not the same as the author of the Gospel of John or the letters of John. The Greek style, it's called the Asian style, meaning Asia Minor style. And the theology of the book of Revelation are very different from the theologies of John, the Gospel of John and the letters of John. And so we don't know who wrote the book of Revelation, but it's portrayed as somebody named John, but there's no identification of which John this is. There is persecution that is talked of in the book of Revelation. And so the question is, when did this persecution take place? And a reasonable date, or it's been usually thought to be reasonable, to date this between 81 and 96, when Domitian was the emperor. And the problem is the evidence for any kind of widespread formal persecution of Christians during the reign of Domitian, the evidence is lacking. Eusebius in the 4th century, apparently quoting Hegesippus and others of his sources, Eusebius was present at the Council of Nicaea. But in the 4th century, Eusebius's church history tells us that the persecution under Domitian was very cruel. But on the other hand, Eusebius was writing in the 4th century, so he would not have known it directly and could only know it through his sources. And we know that there are other sources, other church histories that he draws on, such as the one of Hegesippus. And so Schmidt argues that it is much more likely that early Christians were regularly subjected to regional and informal mistreatment rather than formal persecution. It was harassment. Maybe the local people were doing it, but we don't really have any hard evidence about Domitian doing it and ordering that it be done. And so that's a very, very good question. And so some scholars drop the idea that Revelation was written during the time of Domitian because the evidence for a big-time cruel persecution under Domitian is lacking. And so historical criticism of the book of Revelation certainly suggests to us that instead of trying to relate it to what's going to happen in the future as far as we're concerned, we should try to interpret Revelation in the context of the first century church in Asia Minor suffering at least harassment from locals or regional harassment, but nothing that's necessarily directed from Rome. And so historical criticism is very strongly oriented to the identification of the author's intent when the author was writing the biblical text. What I want to know is what the author intended to say to the readers when the author wrote the text in question. And that suggests that when you are trying to interpret biblical text, you would like to get as close to the world of the author as you can get. And that traditionally has meant in theological education, traditionally this meant that the students learn the biblical languages. By the way, in the Protestant churches in Germany, they go to to a theological faculty at the universities, and the whole first year of their theological studies, they don't study anything but biblical languages. That's what you do your first year. Of course, they go to seminary, they go to theological training a lot longer than our people do, and they're better trained than our people. Anyway, Schmidt points out that the roadmap or the mythic reading of the Bible do not have the kind of accountability to a biblical author's intent that historical readings do. What this means is that when you try to make Revelation into a roadmap or into some kind of crazy myth, it means that some people can look at the text and say, okay, it means this. Or look at the text and say, oh, it means this. This thing is really the symbol for that, you know? And the problem is, we all want to do that. But the intuitive approach that we all should take to reading any text is grounded in the question, what did the writer mean or intend? And it's not always easy to answer that question, and you can only answer the question in terms of probability. But if you don't have any idea of the author's intended meaning of a biblical text, therefore, in the final analysis, if you don't know or not willing to posit, not willing to say at least provisionally, the author had this in mind, then in the final analysis, you have no way of knowing what a passage did or didn't mean, and you have no way of judging between different interpretations of the text. So in other words, if you look at the book of Revelation and you don't try to relate it to the author's intent, then it's like somebody looks at clouds and he says, well, I see a doggy and a horsey. And somebody else looks at the same clouds and, no, there's no horsey up there, I see something else. And so we would like to avoid that kind of arbitrariness. And so by using historical criticism, we try to have readings that are as grounded as possible in trying to understand the author's intent. And if you don't do that, then basically it's kind of like the astronauts. And Houston says to the astronauts, Apollo, you have now left the orbit of the Earth. And we don't think that we should try to leave the orbit of what was going on in the first century church when we're reading their literature. And so you can assume that Revelation was written in the late first century from the standpoint of churches in Asia Minor that were undergoing some kind of harassment or local or regional persecution. And it's not hard to believe that there would have been people in provinces far away from Rome, or maybe in the city of Rome, who would see the Roman Empire, the whole system, as extremely and intrinsically evil, and who would imagine a time and an era in which the evil empire would be combated by a God of justice, right? And so it's not hard to see that somebody who was really persecuted in one way or another would be able to imagine that a God of justice would eventually, in God's good time, would intervene. And that's what this book is about. And so that's my way of interpreting the book of Revelation, using historical criticism. And so that's my answer. And you probably have answers too. Or maybe you have questions. What are your questions? When you're ordained to the priesthood in the Episcopal Church, the standing committee and bishop of the diocese in which you're ordained has to be assured that you are proficient in 6 areas, of which the first is Holy Scripture. Holy Scripture, church history, Christian theology, ethics and moral theology, worship, including the prayer book and the hymnal and other liturgical texts, and ministry in contemporary society. And so you have to be found to be and certified to be proficient in those 6 areas in order to be ordained to the priesthood. Well, what we tried to do at Codrington College and the other seminaries in the University of the West Indies system is that we all had introduction to the Old Testament interpretation, intro to the New Testament interpretation, and then for New Testament we had, of course, there was also 2 semesters of Greek and 2 semesters of Hebrew. And while I was there, we required each of our students that were getting a degree to have 2 semesters of Greek or 2 semesters of Hebrew. And then the level 2 courses that I taught were, I taught a course on the Synoptic Gospels, which could be on any of them. I taught the Pauline letters. I taught the later Pauline letters. And then I may have taught in another course, and then I taught a level 3 course that I introduced called Pauline Theology. And so basically, you start with the questions of historical interpretation. In other words, when it was written and by whom, and then you begin to say, okay, if it was written by this person, by Paul, then you can say when you read Romans 9 through 11, where he's saying, okay, you Gentiles, this is written to you Gentiles. And by the way, you were the wild olive shoots that were unnaturally grafted into the trunk of the real olive tree. Then that has something to do with Gentile Christians accepting Jewish Christians in Romans 9 through 11. So in a level 2 course, you begin to get the student to sort of think using the historical tools. And then when you do that, you begin to get them to think, okay, Paul's theology of this thing, the second coming or Jews versus Gentiles or whatever, is like this. Therefore, Paul had this theology. So in other words, you can't get to understanding Paul's theology, for example, of Romans, until you have understood the literary and historical aspects of Paul's letters. So basically, you have to start with the nuts and bolts. Well, I think that this underlines what you just described, underlines how different people's readings of the book of Revelation are, and the presuppositions of different readings of the book of Revelation. And so what you have, I don't want to say brick wall, but what you have run into, what you described in detail is this is where we are in American Christianity, is we've got a lot of people who want to give you readings of the Bible that are not very historically or literarily based, but are based on some kind of theology that they kind of impose on the biblical texts, that the theology may not have really come from the biblical texts, but are kind of imposed on those biblical texts. And so in our seminaries, United Methodist seminaries and Episcopal seminaries, Roman Catholic seminaries, the more respectable Lutheran seminaries, we try to teach the student to do exegesis, to sort of read out of the text what you can read from the text, rather than to have your own ideas about the text that you then impose on the text when you read it. So one of the things that we are not as good at as we should be is Christian formation is not just for the priests. Christian formation to be a mature Christian adult is for everybody, and that's got to include the Bible. And when you try to do Christian formation and I'm not saying the Bible is everything, but when you do Christian formation and you're not really focusing on adult, well-grounded readings of the Bible, then when our people get interested in the Bible, they don't listen to Episcopal clergy, they listen to the people at those other kind of churches. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so important that the Episcopal Church survive in northern Louisiana, because we are mainstream Christians. So, there's no golden key that, you can pick the golden key and put it in the lock and turn it, and, there's no power pill like Pac-Man. But basically, you have to ask those questions of who, what, when, where, and why any biblical text was written. And when you ask those questions in faith, there are people out there that are interested in answering those questions. I'm on a YouTube channel frequently called History Valley, and there are all sorts of people who are asking those questions about early Christian texts. Many of them disagree with me, but nonetheless, at least we're asking the questions of these texts. So I think that's at least a step in the right direction. But I would like it if more parish clergy would spend a lot more time and a lot more energy teaching their people the Bible. But that's the soapbox I'm always on. So you've heard that before.